Mixing metal guitars can be a real struggle, and this used to be the case for me until I realized that a lot of the problems I was having were actually problems with the rest of the mix. So in this video, I'm going to show you some proven ways to make space for your guitars and their relationship to the other main elements in your mix to make sure you end up with a balanced and professional sounding mix every time. So it can be great to try and make space for every individual element of your mix, but for certain instruments like kick drums and bass guitars, there's going to be an overlap of the frequencies that they share. But when it comes to dialing in a great guitar sound, you may have already had a really great tone, but ended up tweaking it too much because something else in your mix was actually throwing you off. And this is like a painter standing way too close to the canvas, focusing in on one small detail and making it worse because really they needed to take a step back and look at the big picture. Maybe it was something else in the painting that was throwing them off. So how do you get a great mix that does your guitar tone justice? One of the first things you should assess is just the level of your guitars. Sometimes if guitars feel too thin, it's just that they're too quiet. And if they feel too muddy, it could just be that they're too loud. But generally speaking, there are some principles you can stick to. I'm going to go through each of the main elements of a mix: kick, snare, bass, and guitars, and talk about where they typically live in a balanced mix. But before we go through this, it's important to consider what your source material is. So if you're working with raw drums that have no EQ, no processing on them, this is going to be different to drums that are already treated. So instead of talking about EQ moves, I'm just going to be talking about where the frequencies typically live on a balanced mix. So we're going to be looking at them. So I've got a mix here, and before we get to guitars, I'm going to talk about some of the other main elements. So kick drum, snare, and bass guitar. And this is how it currently sounds with no EQ on the guitars. The drums that I'm working with are pre-mixed, so they don't need anything doing to them. So if you're working with raw drums or a drum library that isn't pre-mixed, then you may need to EQ them. I'm going to be showing you what good kick drums look like. So the drums in this demo are from my plugin, Ultimate Heavy Drums. They've all been pre-processed, pre-mixed. And a good thing that I'd recommend you doing, that I've done over the years, is find pre-mixed, either from a record or a pre-mixed library of sounds that sound finished, and then you work with raw sounds and A/B against these finished sounds and see how you can get your, let's say, raw drum sounds or raw guitar sounds to sound like these finished tones, and try and learn what sort of processing and what EQ you gravitate towards on all the drum sounds that you like. So typically for me, I like most of my low end coming in around 70 hertz on kicks. Now around 150 to 250 can be really muddy. If you have too much of this, it's not going to sound as deep. But if you cut all of this out, it's not going to have some of that chesty thump to it. In terms of the high end on kicks, I like it to live between 2 to 5K. Higher up than that starts to sound a bit like a wet splat, and I don't actually like that. So some people mix a lot of high end in. I prefer my kick drums to cut through the mix in the same way that a guitar tone does. So when you've got some fast double pedal and some alternate picking, the high end on the kicks and the high end on the guitars kind of lock in. So this is an example of when sharing frequencies can sound really pleasing. So I've got a kick soloed, and let's look at it. So that area there, that's where I want most of the low end to come through, and you can see that's the loudest area of the low end on the kick. In this area, you'll hear a lot of this in a raw kick drum sound that hasn't had any EQ applied to it. So it's pretty common to do a really big scoop. As I said, the sounds that you're hearing are pre-processed and pre-mixed, so I don't need to do anything, I'm just showing you. And typically for metal kick drums, there's a lot of mid-range scoops out. It can sound quite pleasing to do a wide boost at 1K though, if you want a bit more of that mid coming through. For me, I have my high end on the kick coming through around 5K, and then it kind of tapers off either side of it. So having a scoop in this area on metal kick drums is very common, and because guitars occupy so much mid-range, it's kind of handy to not have anything overlapping. Up next, I'm going to be looking at snare drums. Now, typically, you're going to have most of your body coming through around 200, and then most of your attack coming through from 3 to 7K in that area. Now, it's pretty common for snares to be quite flat across the mid-range with a bit of a scoop around like 700. It really depends on the snare sound that you like. A raw snare drum mic'd up with a 57 with no EQ is going to be really mid-range heavy, and there's going to be a lot around 500 to 700, and that typically gets scooped out quite heavily. Again, we're working with Ultimate Heavy drums here, so this has been pre-processed. It's had EQ, compression, saturation, clipping, transient designer, all that kind of stuff already applied to it, so it's pre-mixed sounding, and this is how it looks. So this is pretty much where most of the body lives in the snare drum. That's where a lot of the note comes through, and then a lot of the attack is coming through in this area, and we've got a bit of a scoop happening as well, so it sounds a bit fatter. And I'm going to come back to snare when we get to guitars. So up next, going to look at bass. So it's pretty common for the 130 area to get quite congested. That's already been kind of scooped out of the bass tone. I've got a regular tone and a mid-range tone here that are both getting sent to a bass group. I'm going to talk about what that mid-range tone is doing in a second. But just in terms of what the general curve looks like on my bass processing, and again, really depends on the bass tone that you're going for, there's usually a bit of a scoop around 200 to 500. This area between 100 to 300 is where a lot of warmth lives on your bass, and it can get kind of muddy. So just having just the right amount to really feel and hear the bass, particularly on small headphones like AirPods, is quite crucial, but you don't want to scoop too much of it out. And then typically a lot of the sub is coming through around 50. Now a really important area, at least for me on bass, is around 600 to 800, and it's this mid-range sound. It's that kind of gargle area to the bass tone, and it helps it be heard above the guitars. And then the brightness usually lives around 3K for me. It's quite common for me to low pass everything above 5K like this, but that's already been done. So a trick that I'll show you that I think Andy Sneap has done a lot in the past, and Scott Atkins does it. So you duplicate your bass tone, and then you have a second one where you've just kind of left in nothing but that mid-range gargly area. So we're just left with this area of the tone, and it sounds like this. And then what you do is you limit this really heavily. And even if you've got a really clean bass tone, even if it's just on the DI, if you limit the mid-range that heavily, it gives the illusion of distortion because it's got that ever-present sound that a distorted bass kind of has. And having that really consistent mid-range to your bass will help it be heard throughout the mix. So this is how the bass sounds on its own. And that was me turning up the mid-range track. And I'll show you that within the context of a mix. Okay, so now onto guitars. The tone for this is from my first ever Kemper pack, and it's a profile of a PV-XXX amp. So you may have seen the video that I made, which is essentially a cheat sheet for guitar frequencies and learning what the main ones are and what they do to your tone. So first up, working from left to right, we're just going to remove all the sub below 60 Hertz with a high pass filter. Now this area here around 130 to 150 is where a lot of that muddy palm mute sound lives, and we can actually carve just a little bit of this out of the tone. Now this next area along around 400 is where a lot of the warmth and the note clarity lives. Having a good amount of that in your raw guitar tone is quite important. So it means that if you've got a little bit too much, you can just kind of carve it out. And if you've got quite a warm bass tone, taking a little bit out of your guitars and letting your bass fill in that area is a good thing to do. Then up next, the mid-range area between 600 to 800 is where the bass tone is kind of living with that gargle. So we can take a little bit of that out as well to make space for the bass. Now between 1 to 2K can be quite nasal sounding, and this is also where a lot of vocal clarity lives. So not having too much of it is quite handy for guitars. but it's better to have a bit too much of this area in your raw guitar tone and then be able to take it out in the mix, as opposed to having not enough of it in your raw tone and trying to artificially add it back in, because it just never sounds quite the same. But albums like the Black Album, Far Beyond Driven, loads of old school death metal records have a really big scoop around this area, and it adds a bit more warmth to your tone. And I'll do a big scoop, and as I slowly bring it back in, you'll kind of hear why a lot of those records don't actually have too much of this frequency area. Between 2 to 5K is the most important area of your guitar tone, and if you've recorded a great sounding amp and a great sounding cab, there should be enough of this already in the tone in its raw state. But I'd rather go too dark on my raw tone and be able to brighten it up in the mix, as opposed to having too much fizz and trying to get rid of it later on. But I think at the moment there's a good amount here that I don't actually need to add any high end in for the bite area. So let's have a listen. So this next area here, there's not too much fizz, but I think I could probably get a bit more of a hard edge to my tone if I get rid of a bit of 6K. You may have seen the video that I did about adding a more hard edge to your tone. I go into detail about why this makes a difference and why I do it. So let's start by taking a bit of that out. So there's not really a lot of that area in the raw tone, but I still think it sounds better with that cut in there. And the tone's not overly bright or fizzy in the top end around 10K, so I don't really need to do a really hard low pass filter. Now the guitars, as they were before, were in a pretty good place in the mix in terms of the level. Because I've taken out all of these frequencies, we're going to have reduced the level of the guitars. So I'm going to bump the level back up with the output level on the EQ itself. So now as I toggle the EQ on or off, you can hear the difference and what this EQ is doing to the guitars and their clarity and their space in the mix. So really nailing your mid-range for guitars is really important. This next technique is a way to give your snare body its own place in the mix, particularly in the mastering stage when you start to limit an entire mix. If your snare starts to get lost or it sounds a bit more papery and thin, this is a technique to help give it its own space. So if we look at the snare on a frequency analyzer, I've got it soloed. This is where the body of the note is, around 200, and this area will change depending on the tuning of the drum. So if you look at this area as I jog the pitch wheel in Ultimate Heavy Drums on the snare, you'll see that the body of the snare is going to move around. So at the moment the snare body lives at 200, and now quite luckily for us, the body is only in a really, really narrow area. It's not like a huge wide area. It literally is just kind of like this. So one thing we can safely do is remove that from a lot of other instruments. So if we go back to guitars, luckily for us, 200 is still quite a muddy area for our guitars. And if we just focus in on the exact area that the snare body is, there's not even a lot of it in the raw guitar tone, but we can safely remove quite a bit of that now. same thing for our bass tone. Now, if you really wanted to, you could sidechain, but I'd rather not do that with guitars, bass, and snare drums. It's a bit convoluted. So if we go back to this guitar EQ and we think about the kick drum, as I said, I like the low end on my kick drum to be most prominent around 70 Hertz. And luckily for us as guitarists, that's not normally an area of guitars that is most prominent in the guitar tone. There's still a bit of it in there, but there's not as much as this area, and there's definitely a lot more high end in the tone as well. Now, bass guitar and kick drums do share a lot of overlapping frequencies, and it's quite common to sidechain these. But I like to practice mixing without sidechaining and not using it as a crutch, and try and find space just with EQ to try and make them work together. So again, just looking on a frequency analyzer, 70 Hertz isn't the most prominent area of my bass tone. It's still that 130 area that's most prominent in the bass tone, and the most prominent area of the kick drum is 70. So the bass low end lives a bit higher up than the kicks. So they're already quite balanced with each other, and I don't need to sidechain. And when it comes to the high end on the kicks, sharing a similar area to the high end on the guitars, remember kick drums are just a split-second sound, and they're not a consistent sound like guitars are usually in a song. So even though they overlap, even if it's really fast double pedal, the kick attack is such a short sound that it's really pleasing when they work together. Having a good mid-range is really important for your guitars, but clearing some of this mid-range up actually gives space to things like vocals, and it puts more emphasis on the area of your guitar tone that you want to cut through, which is this area. So I don't even really need to boost that area at all, because I've already done some carving in other areas. So you can have two approaches to EQ, and you can either do subtractive EQ, where you just remove frequencies, or you can just boost the frequencies that you really want to hear the most. So I'm pretty happy with those final moves that I've made on the guitars there. There's actually quite a lot of low end between 50 to 80 Hertz on the guitars in the raw tone, which is pretty good. So I can actually remove up to 70 and it still sounds pretty weighty in that area. So hopefully this has given you some help on how to better balance your mix. If you want to download some of my pre-mixed impulse responses for your guitar tones, I'll put a link down in the description. And if you're still struggling with your drum mix, then check this video out next.